Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's about 2 minutes after 1 o'clock. We're gonna let some people join us here for a couple minutes. We'll begin the second part of an executive series on risk-enabled growth. So if you want to grab a bottle of water or whichever or something like that, we will get started here probably in the next 2 minutes. All right, one more minute, we'll get started. Good afternoon to people that have just recently joined. We'll get started here in a moment for the next part of the series, executive series on risk-enabled growth. Okay, I've got 4 minutes after, so we're going to get started with this afternoon. Second part of the series around executive series on risk-enabled growth. Hopefully you're able to join us for the first session as to why we want to create a risk-optimized organization to achieve the strategic goals. This session is going to be a little bit more about how to achieve those things. We've brought together a partnership together with online business systems, Taurseer and RiskNeutral. At this time, I'd like to introduce a couple of people on the panel here to talk about the subject. Greg, if you'd like to introduce yourself real quick, and then we'll move on.
Great, thanks, Rob. Yeah, I'm Greg. I work as one of the principal consultants at Online, looking after some of their software-based standards in terms of providing validation and certification services for that. I work with Robin and the team at Online, and I'll hand that over to yourself, Jeremy.
All right, thank you. Jeremy, would you like to introduce Taurseer and yourself, sir?
Yeah, Jeremy Vaughn, CEO and co-founder of Taurseer. We are a product ops and portfolio risk management and assurance platform. Started working with engineers over a decade ago, and we were hired for innovation and things like that. And what really got me passionate about these topics is a very personal story of mine. And I'm glad I get to share these things with you today.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. And then Jeff Sauntry with RiskNeutral. Would you introduce yourself, Jeff?
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me add my warm welcome. My name is Jeff Sauntry. I'm the CEO of RiskNeutral. We are a professional services advisory firm that helps organizations at the C-suite and board level establish their integrated risk management programs.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. Well, I appreciate the time. Just a couple ground rules. We want to make this kind of very informative and collaborative. If you have questions, please post them in the chat. This session will be recorded and placed onto the website sometime in the next day or so. And then we'll send out an email to you exactly how to get the presentation. And if you haven't had the opportunity or are new to this particular session, that will also be on the website. And then finally, I'd like to just mention this is part of an executive series. This is the last one for this year. After the first of the year, there'll be a second one in a calendar of ones, which will provide that information to you as well. So Jeff, if you'd like to start us off with this slide.
Yep, awesome. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so last time, for those of you who weren't with us, I'll just recap quickly kind of what we talked about. So the concept here is that integrated risk management really kind of has three main parts. What we're going to focus on is down at the bottom. So if the overall goal for most organizations is to have a risk optimized organization, We're going to focus today on the enterprise-wide components down at the bottom. Greg and Jeremy will walk us through those. But basically, this is what the C-suite and what the CEO and board of directors can do to encourage the organization to be risk-aware, risk-optimized, so that they can essentially capitalize and create the greatest amount of value and not fall into the pitfall that many people do, which is under realizing the capabilities and not executing on their actual strategies. How this ties together, and Rob alluded to just a moment ago that this is the second in a series. The other things we'll talk about and the way this kind of integrates with a broader story is if you go to the upper left, you know, this is risk as a team sport. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. And being a good industry partner is very important. So this is where you want to work with your ISACs, you want to work with your board of directors, your external stakeholders to really start working through, you know, the capabilities that are required to, you know, not get blindsided by risk, but to cost effectively and from an operations perspective, come up with an acceptable exposure profile for the organization. And that really comes down to, you know, basically protecting tangible and intangible assets, kind of baking the universe down into maybe some informed scenarios that you'd like the C-suite and the board to be aware of that might be contributing the most risk to the organization. And then finally, going through some of the discipline of actually using things like FAIR models and quantifying some of those risks so that some financial decisions can be made on how to mitigate and address those particular risks. So if you do those things well internally as an organization and you're a good industry partner, then hopefully the upper right will happen and the market will reward you with being a market leader versus just being a marginalized provider. I think unfortunately we see plenty of people in the headlines for the wrong reasons here, where they don't do things like protect their intellectual property properly, or they have unfortunately something happen to something related to their physical assets, and they're getting a lot of press for maybe the wrong reasons. But really what you want to do here is, from a market perspective, is you want to exploit the mega trends that are available to you. E-commerce would be a great example of transitioning from brick and mortar to a more lucrative revenue stream. And then you also want to continuously earn shareholder trust. So I think in this day and age with social media and those types of platforms, it's very easy to have bad things spread very quickly. So I think part of the integrated strategy for an organization is continuing to earn shareholders' trust almost continuously. And then finally, if you do have a good handle on your risk management program, you're able to do things like introduce risk-based pricing, because you're able to offer additional services at a lower risk that many clients may be willing to pay a premium for. And then finally, across the top, really the bow that ties all of this together is that your industry partner and your market will reward you if your senior management team does their best to minimize deviation from expected outcomes and basically delivers on the promises they make. Rob, turn it over to you.
Actually, Jeff, so on this particular slide, we're now focusing in on a little bit more of the enterprise-wide assets of things. So from that perspective, we have three areas that we are going to address today: the ubiquitous mission, the aligned resources, and orchestrated oversight that's associated with that. So as Jeff was kind of pointing out, right, it's all about getting proper visibility, right? Being able to provide sound governance on those emerging risks that potentially come across the core domains. And that's either around strategy, operations, finance, compliance, or reputation. And we'll dive a little bit more about that in the next slide. But in this particular one, we're all about trying to increase or maximize the value that we created and not realize on the strategic aspect of things and the downward pressures that particularly come with that. Jeff, is there anything else you'd like to add on that particular point?
No, Rob, you did a good job of handling that. I'm sorry, it's supposed to be my slide. Thank you.
No worries, sir. All good. So on this particular slide, we're talking about the three layers of the fence. As you can see, as we kind of articulate here, a typical organization and how they're set up from, you know, on the left-hand side, from development to operations to security. And those are the initial layer or the first layer of defense. Those are those individuals that are at the grassroots that are trying to build upon in the development, like adding more features, more business to consumer value, innovation. Another key area is that all a part of the development aspect of things, and they are siloed across the industry as they go through, even from an operations centric aspect of things. So you have the data center, you have infrastructure, you're trying to maintain your operations uptime, reliability, stability. All these are key metrics that are up underneath the operations perspective. And then you look at security, right? And security and the threat vectors that particularly come in and being able to protect the data. God forbid you have an instance or aspect of things, or what I like to counsel a lot of the CISOs is not being the no person, right? Risk averse to every business opportunity. You've got to be able to have a little bit of that yes to be able to help that business move forward, and utilizing some of those activities in those particular silos. So if you look at the blue area, these are the actual lines of defense, but even within those areas, they are siloed, right? And each of them have reporting up structures that are into the executive nature or executive board, depending on where they fall in, whether you're the CISO or the CIO, or you may even have a CRO or COO, depending on what parts of that. And each of those things are kind of have different visibility within the focus or the lens that they have that's associated with that. And then you got the guys that like myself and Greg, the compliance guys, they're coming along, right, to help out in that to do the audits, talk about the frameworks, how are accountability and perspective there. That's kind of getting up to, and they usually will have the compliance orientated, will have the dotted line into the executives as well, whether it's underneath the audit side of the practice or the CFO in that particular realm. And then the third layer is actually the board of directors, right? So how are those kind of play out into that? So Jeff's going to talk a little bit more at the executive level and about the board level on this particular slide. Jeff?
Yeah, so just what I'd say here is that, the 3 lines of defense is a pretty popular model in some of the more highly regulated industries like financial services. But the reality is I think, this is a good slide. It's not meant to be an eye chart, but the reality is it's busy. But I think what it represents is the modern organization that basically has everyone in their silos working on the things they're supposed to, trying to hit the metrics that are important to their executive management team. But what they really should be doing in a risk optimized organization is leveraging the cognitive diversity of those teams so that everyone has a voice at the table and is trying to achieve the same things, which is, optimize the organization's output to achieve the strategic goals of the organization. So one of the things that we'll show here in this transition is that many organizations are working very hard to try to break down those barriers where everyone is working in a silo and working more in a collaborative fashion. I think it's easy on an org chart to talk about, collaboration and kind of a matrixed organization, but in reality, the 3 lines of defense, I think, is a very, very good model. If you're not familiar with it, I suggest you maybe look it up and see how it might be implemented in your organization. It scales to both large and small organizations. But the reality is I think that the board of directors in particular, as well as the C-suite, are looking to get more involved in the risk management aspects of it by creating a risk appetite for the organization to follow. I think it's a great best practice to actually have a business unit risk owner so that all of the burden isn't falling onto the technical staff to address the technical concerns and cyber and data privacy concerns. And then, as Rob mentioned before, there's a ton of external stakeholders, everything from like the external assessors that Greg and Rob serve to your stakeholders and just your industry partners. So I think this is a great slide that everyone could probably adapt to their organization, but I do think it represents the current landscape in most clients that we interact with.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. Jeremy, would you like to?
All right. So last presentation was high level. We used integrating growth strategies as M&A as an example. However, whether you're integrating a new company, new people, new programs, processes, tools, doesn't really matter. The concept that we're talking about here is universal when we're talking about operationalizing a risk management program. So this slide in particular, it is chaotic and it is on purpose. But simply what we're trying to say is, you can go back and digest this slide later on. But what we're trying to say is, think of it like a house. In your life, when you have more family, your house grows. You accumulate more things. As you accumulate more things, it's harder to focus on the things that matter, like preventative maintenance, and other things that matter that just kind of go by the wayside. You may get an alarm system, you may not. But if you do get an alarm system, it's a big house. Does the alarm system tell you where the problem is specifically? What is the most important problem? And for example, what matters? What matters in all this stuff? But what really happens is we accumulate a lot, in this particular example, a lot of debt. There's terms out there in the industry: security debt, technical debt. There's things that we're deploying to kind of satisfy compliance requirements or other requirements to try to tackle those issues. But in reality, a lot of these things happen where humans ourselves, we can't recognize them. They don't live within the tools. They go out and they live within the gaps that the tools don't cover. And so as the house grows, or as the enterprise grows, more people are added, more tools, more processes. And this is really what we're talking about. You can't manage or secure what you can't see. And so we'll go into the next slide with that. So last presentation, we talked about the catch me if you can mentality. I'll go in with a story. A couple years ago, all the way up until, I would say, this last couple 12 months to 2 years, we've seen a lot of hacker-led approaches. That way you get caught and then you start working on these things. What I've seen recently is more CEOs, more COOs, more CFOs participating on these calls. And what's happening is we're seeing this customer-led situation. And it's actually kind of embarrassing because it's slowing down the sales cycle. The CEO is like, hey, we just closed this big deal, but they're asking weird questions. They're asking us to fill out this questionnaire. They're asking us to show them how they're doing in their security program. And a lot of times it's null, or a lot of times they don't know how to answer these things. And so if you're getting that feedback already, where customers are starting to ask you, and this is what happens, the technology companies, the software companies that have been hacked and exposed this whole problem, they didn't have these things in place. And then customers saw that a lot of the vendors were the weakest link in the supply chain. And so what we're asking is to get more proactive. Proactive leads to customer trust, confidence among all of your stakeholders, your customers, and partners, and even your employees. And so just really wanted to point that out, that there's really only two choices when we talk about these things. Rob, and next. All right, so I know this is a bit detailed of a diagram, but also on the last presentation, we talked about context. And so let me explain this a little bit. There's a whole, and we talked about this a lot. So there's development, there's security, there's compliance, there's operations. The problem is all these folks are living and doing the right things in the tools in these different silos. That's great. However, there's no context. We don't know what to work on and why it's important and what's the most critical things. And so we took a step back and we mapped out like all of the things that we're using to get visibility, to work on the risks. And so we're deploying. So look at the very center, your application or your product or your software. This is mentioned in most compliance requirements, but is often always overlooked. And so the worms in the middle are kind of demonstrating, hey, these are your controls. These are your administrative, your technical controls, your processes, things that live around your product. These are also your code, your infrastructure, and all of the tools that we use to manage, monitor, and all that, and get all of the information. But everything is wrapped around an application or a product across all of these silos. And what those pills are, or what the pills on the edge, the green, represent, or these are examples of a lot of the things that are being missed or overlooked within the tools. So when we talk about vulnerabilities within security, a lot of people think that's network vulnerabilities, endpoint, code. There's way too much emphasis on the code. What we're missing is all of the changes, all of the things that are occurring within or between the tools that are not correlated, risky changes, behaviors. So an example for shadow IT, somebody spins up a virtual machine, nobody knows about it, a specific person forgets about it. And it's not only causing a risk because it's unsecured, it's also causing a financial risk because that's taking up on costs that nobody knows about. Shadow engineering, these are code, these are projects that live outside of IT's purview, and they're non-secured, they're not following best practices. These are all things that are going by the wayside. And we're trying to simplify with this diagram. And again, you can go back and pause this, but once you see this, it's kind of it's hard to unsee this specific thing and how you integrate all of the different tool sets in one unified view. And Rob, so how do we operationalize what we just saw, right? And so what you just saw was more of a integration model or methodology. Like I said, we were a product ops risk management platform. This is something that we've done to create a integrated model to create data flows from the different specific siloed departments to get everybody collaborating and seeing the right things around the right assets. But what happens is, how do you operationalize all of the things that are going by the wayside? You know, these can be sourced by your compliance requirements, and these are insights. These are alerts. These are things that again can be sourced by compliance. They can be sourced by CFOs, CTOs, CISOs, people that are knowledgeable about the tool sets that say, hey, if I wanted to know about this risk occurring across my organization, what data sets do I need to correlate to get that cognition, is what we call it, but to get that cognition to fire when that thing happens across the organization. And so without context, it's really hard or almost impossible to create these cognitions that hold people accountable to, hey, this misconfiguration just occurred, we need to go fix that. This threat just occurred, we need to go fix that. And so this gives you an example here on the right-hand side of different cognitions that we can create. The whole point to this is using data science to our advantage and operationalizing risks in a correlated way that monitors behaviors.
Righty, thanks guys. So in terms of taking it a bit step further, and we start looking at the systemic risk treatment and continuous assurance model, suffice it to say, you know, they generally form part of the enterprise-wide mission objectives in terms of how to, you know, build a risk-based culture. It contributes towards the aligning of resources. And the way we've gone about this, you know, is to look at the building of a mature risk management framework. When we do that, generally within a systemic risk model, there's criteria that applies. So in terms of preluding to the next slides that will take place, we start looking at what those criteria are, and we need to find some form of a baseline as to how do we actually measure whether we're doing the right thing or not. And what we've generally looked at is basing it on a prescriptive standard, right? So we've gone and said, we need to pick a baseline that we understand is prescriptive. And the one that we've chosen is the PCI SSF SLC. That's the software lifecycle program. And what that allows for participants in the financial services industry is to be able to validate themselves against a standard that gives them the opportunity to be listed on the council's website. It's prescriptive mostly because all vendors that are releasing financial services products that include payment gateways and the like need to abide by a specific standard. So for us, it's a very easy standard to be able to correlate against. but the methodologies and the processes are applicable to most standards out there. There is generally a very good amount of best practice applied to a lot of the standards, but we've chosen one specifically that's prescriptive because of the benefits thereof. So you can jump forward, Rob. So in terms of the SSF standard for SLC, it's generally split into 4 main goals. And for each of the slides on the left, I'll talk about the standard itself. And on the right, we'll get Jeremy to allude in terms of how the platform actually provides those kind of deliverables. So when we start off here with the software security governance element of it, it's the first goal within the standard. There's roughly 10 control objectives throughout the whole standard, and they're dotted through the 4 main goals, and we'll cover each of those 4 main goals. I do make a point of saying the very first requirement within the actual standard is that leadership actually takes responsibility, formal responsibility of a program, authorizes the roles for the individuals that have to participate, assigns the responsibility, and then themselves provide accountability overall for the development life cycle. And that you'll see in brackets, I've actually put there CO1. It's actually, just to allude to, that's actually the first control objective within the standard. This forms part of the ubiquitous missions, and the applicable people in the organization that would most likely be looking out for these are the risk officers. There needs to be provision of regular status updates, performance changes, any development initiatives. Those could be on an anniversary process or periodic process or on significant changes. And these themselves, are requirements within the standards. And we need to have mechanisms to be able to show that those elements are actually taking place and that those initiatives are being covered. One of the points within the control objectives of the first goal is also to ensure that there's a regular checkpoint within the development life cycle. And that what that means to us is that there needs to be a point in time where everything is actually provided in a tangible manner that includes the reviews, the scans that have to be conducted, and the use of automated tools to check and/or manual processes to check individuals' code and go through the process of ensuring that the life cycle is maintained in a mature and a good way. And from that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy, who'll talk about how some of the platform deliverables actually address these requirements directly.
Yep, thank you. And so a lot of what we're talking about here should and can be automated. And I know a lot of the compliance requirements are annual. And so what we took a step back and said is we can do this to match with what's actually happening in the environment, which is things are being changed and pushed to production, which means risks are being accelerated to the marketplace, or i.e. your customer, at a rate several times a day, hundreds of times a day. And a platform should be able to keep up with that. Doing these things every year, you're falling by the wayside of keeping up with protecting that growth, which is ultimately protecting your customers and that shareholder value. And so we took a step back and said, how can we do this? And what we realized is, and MITRE started talking about it here at the beginning of the year, and going back to the integration model that I just described, is once we're able to capture and integrate those data flows in a contextual way from all the tools, you're able to create what we call trusted baselines. And this is what MITRE refers to. All of the people, the code, the processes, the tools that are being used are now contextualized around a product. That product is now able to say, hey, this is what this team is doing. This is who's related to this team. These are the activities of this team. And you should be able to create a portfolio-wide view, very contextual to these metrics. And so just to give an example, we were working with an insurance company a couple of years ago, and there was a portfolio owner, and he understood very well what we were trying to accomplish. And he was like, oh, I have 10 product teams that are working under me. And I have no idea between those 5 to 7 people, between those 10 product teams, what's happening. And so just as an experiment, we said, go ask, what code they're writing in, what vulnerabilities do they have? what's the most important things that we should be working on? And a lot of times, and this isn't anybody's fault, is it's, hey, we should work on the level 10 rated vulnerability, or the, you know, the thing related to this asset because somebody told me to. Well, is that aligned with the business? Is that the most critical vulnerability that impacts a lot of assets? Without this integration model, without this context, you can't really tell that and be able to work on the right things. And so within software security governance, again, the cognition engine, the cognitions that we talked about earlier, informing things that are out of policy or rules that you set forth within your organization. And with that, we'll jump into just some easy screenshots.
Yep. And
so,
Jeremy, one thing I'll add as you transition here. I think the other thing is important that maybe hasn't been netted out a little bit more is just, you know, the big thing here isn't that, you know, the market hasn't come up with some good technical solutions for technical issues. I think the thing that we're really addressing here is trying to discuss how we establish accountability within the organization and how we implement administrative controls, which I think are the ones that, you know, most often are the ones getting people in trouble these days.
Yep. I think it's north of 79% of exploited things or misconfigurations, human errors, an insider threat. An insider threat, I think, it doesn't have to be a malicious insider threat. It could be just something that, you know, somebody made a mistake. Mistakes happen all the time. And, you know, as you saw on the last slide, a couple slides ago, developers are incentivized to move fast, break things. Like, we literally put that into the culture, but we can't go back and punish them now. But now we're able to say, hey, now we're able to find those things that are broken as you're doing your work, and you should just fix them within the flow of that work. And so this right here, really quickly, this is a product-centric view. And what we're doing here is we're automating product analytics, and you're getting insights. And so it's very different than showing you analytics and trends where things have already occurred. We're saying, hey, somebody changed something. This produced a result or vulnerability or security issue or risk. This is something that happened right now that should be worked on in the environment, very contextualized. An example right here, another large organization, back to Jeff's point, deploying the administrative controls. You know, you have your code security analysis tools, you have network tools, you have a lot of these tools. The assumption at the executive level a lot of times is, I bought the tool has been deployed. And it also has been deployed on the right assets. There's no, if I go and ask a question, how do you know if that tool has been deployed, configured correctly, and you're getting the right data from that tool? It's hard to do that via a manual way. We should automate those things. And if those configurations change and we're not receiving the right data, you know, 3 months from now, that should be also a flagged instance. So like we've gone into many companies where the assumption is, hey, we think these tools have been deployed 80% across these teams. We go in and we start doing the integration, implementation, and a lot of times we find out, hey, one team actually deployed it 100%. Another team started to deploy it, but then they got sidetracked and didn't do anything more with it. A lot of times that can also lead to security issues where a tool is now misconfigured. A hacker can get through a tool. And so that brings up a lot of issues that should be administratively taken care of, and having those insights as they're occurring should be automated. Again, back to you, Greg.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, this brings us to goal number 2 in terms of the standard itself. And I think this is pretty much applicable to the majority of all standards. You know, assets have to be identified. You cannot validate or comply with what you don't know. I think the critical point here, specifically within a product-centric understanding, is that assets are not only the physical assets and the supporting infrastructure that you use within your development cycle, but also the intangible assets. So when we're talking about those, we're talking about functions within a piece of software. We could even be talking about, you know, third-party components within within an application that are used, and the inclusion of those components and understanding of what those components are is critical to be able to monitor and understand where the journey goes in terms of that development life cycle. One of the other critical elements that they bring up on an ongoing basis is perpetual identification and addressing of threats and vulnerabilities. So we kind of split the threats and vulnerabilities into two elements, because vulnerabilities can be looked at from a scanning perspective, and we can look into the code, and we can do static and dynamic code analysis. We can do vulnerability management programs that includes web application penetration testing against specific interfaces. And then the defined scenarios point that I have over here is also related to the threat modeling, because within the software that you actually develop and deploy, there's generally a process of making sure that you don't only test one element or one instance of it. You've got to test across every single deployable scenario that you're planning on actually selling into the market. So if you're making use of multiple types of databases, the vulnerabilities within those stacks also need to be considered. When you do eventually come across any kind of challenges within the standard, they define that there should be some form of enforceable remediation process that has some kind of an SLA attached to it. We can't find and identify problems and then not actually have a timeline in which they get addressed. We need to be able to track those vulnerabilities and those threats and be able to create a defined methodology in terms of how they're actually dealt with. And that's handing back over to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, and so what Greg's really talking to you about is a lot of these things can be accomplished within what I call point tools, point solutions. The problem with deploying, let's say software component analysis and SaaS tools, they live in the results live in separated tools. Without correlating that data and making it contextual, it's really hard to understand what that data does for you and what you should be doing from the data. And so providing that actionable insight is really important. So I'll tie this all together with the MITRE trusted baselines kind of example with the product integration model. And I'll kind of pick on a famous breach that occurred within the last 12 months that is driving all the executive orders. This is a non-malicious insider threat that happens deep down into the practitioner level. It happened in another breach that happened a couple of months ago. An intern or somebody that doesn't really know what they're doing within a specific tool or just makes a mistake. Again, not malicious intent, but they misconfigured something. Let's say a code repo turning from private to public. That data or that wisdom is lost with that developer. It's not collected in one unified platform where you can do something with that data. And so things happen over time, both retrospectively and on a timeline to real time. So what happens if said code repo was injected with malicious code during the time that it was opened, right? And so those two data points happen over time. Nobody knows about it except for the developer that fixed it at that particular time. But correlating those two data points together says, hey, this is a potential supply chain compromise. This is the type of things that you can do with correlating data across all of these tool sets in a unified fashion, using data science as your friend. And so what we're doing here is around all of these things was we're continually mining the process every day and saying, hey, this is what changed. This is what happened. Correlating with other data points that says this is an issue, right? And so if somebody goes and closes out this thing, we go and rescan either the code base and or the process or tool that they've been using. Was it closed out? That's where we come up with the terminology as continuous assurance. And so nobody actually has to go and validate that somebody fixed something in the code. We're rescanning and making sure those things are happening. And so this is an example. So all of the tools running in the background on the dashboard behind vulnerabilities. So as things are changing, these are your vulnerabilities, code weaknesses, security issues that are occurring as things are changing in your environment every single day, right? So cross-site scripting, the OWASP top 10 list that just came out, we have outdated components with vulnerabilities. We're continually monitoring for those things. What also is really important about this is when people are changing things, again, misconfiguration, controls that are, or tools that are being changed, we're no longer receiving data, or as simply as, hey, I don't want this code in my environment anymore, or let's go back to Equifax and say, I'm the CEO at this particular company. I just saw the Wall Street Journal say Apache Struts just blew up Equifax. They were able to get in. Writing a rule, a business rule, in this particular case, an architectural rule that says, I want Apache Struts across my entire portfolio out, within minutes of seeing that article, is really materializing the risk management program to stay within what Jeff says, the desired business outcome. So we're protecting the organization and we're monitoring for things, and we can create those business rules on the fly and hold people accountable at the contextual team level.
Thanks, Jeremy. So looking at the secure software and data management component, this forms one of the third main goals and also forms part of the orchestrated oversight of the overall enterprise-wide mission objectives. It would be applicable mostly to operational officers and risk officers, because they're generally the guys that's looking after the tools that would be used. Generally, most of the tools that are highlighted within these bullet points already exist within an organization to a degree. There's generally a good change management process that's implemented, but not necessarily monitored and correlated against activities that are taking place to ensure that the process is mature and actually being followed through. One of the elements of code repository integrity makes sure that when a code repository is established, that there needs to be authorization and access control processes to the code repository. We need to make sure that people aren't getting access to repositories they shouldn't have access to, and that generally when they're working within a sprint of a certain piece of code, that they don't necessarily have access to the entire repository at their disposal. Similarly, within the terms of deployment integrity, we have to look at, how do we package up the product for delivery? I mean, this has been a big problem, specifically in the case of SolarWinds, in terms of that they were able to actually get malicious code into a sanctified deployment architecture. So these sorts of elements are pretty critical in ensuring that there's a formalized process in terms of ensuring that the code that's to be deployed has been sanctified prior to signing it with valid certificates for deployment to people who trust that code. In terms of working within the environment and the development process, you generally find that a vendor would have access to sensitive information, either from clients if they're busy troubleshooting or debugging or going through a process of trying to resolve problems. And there needs to be a formal way of understanding how is that data dealt with, that there's a proper data retention and disposal process and policy in place to ensure that the usage of the data is used for the period and the time that it's needed for the valid reasons, and it's disposed securely there afterwards. Back to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, so I think this is close to the last one. So back to monitoring process and the tools that we're using. And so this again is deep down in the weeds, but this is where a lot of the risks actually happen and where it's able to be exploited. So kind of going off the trusted baselines, this is a real story too. We were working with another organization. This was a past event. This was a coordinated event. Code repo turned private to public from an internal. Then a external person was able to inject code that they could later on go ahead and exploit. If we had a trusted baseline in a contextual way, we're able to say, hey, a non-team member actually came in here and changed the code. And we're able to see those things happening in an environment. That should be an immediate double alert that always went overlooked, of code repos turning from private to public, people that aren't supposed to be in there doing things and putting in things into the code base. These are process and code related issues, and people not abiding by the process of secure software development lifecycle. So with that being said, back to the integration model. This is operationalizing the diagram that we put out there around the integration model. But essentially, what Jeff said earlier, everything around this particular program is a team sport. So how do we integrate everybody in a coordinated effort to provide risk treatment across the organization, provide more of that autonomous way of dealing with risk and holding people accountable, because now we can apply risk ownership where there never has been before, is now integrating the tools that they are working in. And so continuous process data mining into those tools and saying, hey, we just found this is an issue. And coordinating those people that are supposed to be on that team to do the right work. Here on the other issue or screenshot below, this is an example of showing we're able to capture individual people on the team, activity, behaviors, things like that. And again, this isn't this is an accountability and a risk management measure to make sure that the right people are doing the right things and collecting metrics on that.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I think as the last kind of main goal within the standard itself, we look at this principle of communications, and with secure communications, obviously leading to the optimization of business value. Within each of the applications that get developed, there's generally a living document by the name of an implementation guide. The monitoring and updating and continual development of that document is an element that often gets left behind. So you'd often have an initial guide that's provided in terms of the implementation of the product, but as there's different versions or features or functions are added, that don't update the document in terms of keeping that current with the currently deployed version of software. Those channels of communication and information, need to be updating all of the participants with threats, risk mitigation models, and advice to those customers as to how they resolve problems that are encountered on a timely manner. So if, for example, a threat is discovered or there's some form of vulnerability that's been realized, there should be an effective mechanism for communicating out to the customers that are using those products as to how they can best mitigate those risks. That includes communication to the stakeholders themselves. The participants within these, are generally the risk officers, security officers, and stakeholders themselves as part of orchestrated oversight. And earning the shareholder trust requires an omni-channel communication process and methodology. You've got to be able to communicate very effectively out to people for them to understand that you're on top of your product and that you're providing the guidance that they need.
Yep. And so, using just point solutions alone kind of misses the opportunity to optimize the business value of what we're talking about here. So how do we kind of monetize a risk management program and ensure that we are optimizing what we are collecting from a data perspective, and then providing more value across the organization as one layer. So creating telemetry and KPI for specific stakeholders. These are custom dashboards that can be created based on what people care about. Grouping your applications into portfolio management views enables more structure and control, visibility for your internal IT and product teams that matches your organizational structure. On the reverse side of that, taking that kind of same methodology and applying that to customer groupings and measurement of those specific apps. So your customers may not buy the apps the way that your organization is structured internally, but you're able to now structure metrics and things like that to what your customers really are buying and what they want to see. And what we're starting to see as a trend, the questionnaires that we're starting to kind of squash now, people are wanting to see your customers specifically, SLA metrics, every 30 days, or are we managing these vulnerabilities? Are we doing these things consistently with discipline and rigor? Meaning, are they protecting my organization from their risks? And so this is becoming reality, whereas these breaches over the last 12 months, 2 years, has pushed customers to realize, again, the vendors, the software companies, the people that the value proposition is the technology, is the software, is the product, that they can no longer be the weakest link. And to make the assumption still that, maybe we're a small company, the hacker doesn't want to go after me or whatever, that's so untrue. They also realize you're the weakest link. The biggest companies have the resources to deploy these things. And so it's just easier to get through the weakest link. And then satisfying, and this is a story too. So a lot of companies have to do compliance requirements. They work with external auditors to come in and validate and assess things. I can't tell you how many times this becomes a really great scenario where, hey, my developers are working on compliance. They're some of my most expensive resources. I want them focused on innovation. I want them focused on product, but I have them focused on Excel spreadsheets and screenshots and stuff that they hate doing. And so just by doing the actions that we're talking about here leads to traceable evidence where we can actually give to an auditor to come in and see that they are actually managing their risk real time, all day, every day. And that becomes a huge value proposition, lowering costs, increasing productivity, things like that. And really it enhances the job satisfaction of, hey, I'm a dev, keep me focused on what I love to do, which is build, innovate, create things, and let engineering in technology do the rest for me. And so that's really what we're trying to do here, and optimize, bringing all this data contextually together so we can create more value from it from a business perspective.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I think this slide kind of sums up a lot of what Jeremy's been talking about in terms of the process and the ethos and the methodology, because you'll generally find in amongst them, you'll see quite a long list of standards at the bottom of the slide in there. But within all of these standards frameworks, whether they are prescriptive or non-prescriptive, there's often a good element of software development process that is involved in them, whether it's a PCI-DSS standard or some of the NIST standards, BSIMM standards, OWASP themselves. The list goes on and on and on. And the ability to correlate and get all of this information helps, organizations achieve compliance as a byproduct rather than an orchestrated effort. I've often used the terminology that, compliance, if you threw all the standards out of the window and actually just implemented a really good, governance program that implemented industry best practice, you probably find that you're right on the button in terms of hitting your compliance initiatives as well. Deployment of the platform itself helps you streamline and automate those manual efforts in terms of achieving those compliance controls and perpetually going around looking for documentary evidence. It helps orchestrate all of that process of collecting the information in a good way. At the same time, you're looking at, from a process perspective, making sure that the development lifecycle stays within the rails that it's supposed to, right? You create these guardrails that they can operate within, and that operationalizes your risk management process and policy. And obviously making sure that you can monitor on a regular basis and see where you're tracking with your compliance initiatives, and be able to give yourself a percentage or an understanding of the scores that you're hitting in terms of working within the defined risk appetite tolerances. That helps you also, meet those key performance and key risk elements within an organization, and make sure that you've got a view of those where you would previously not have been able to get that deep insight into what's happening at a product level, and rather just looking at them as individual program tenants. And I mean, this is effectively, the principle as Jeff was talking about earlier on, also creating that transparency and continued dovetailing of the various departments within an organization for them to facilitate effective governance. And I think with that, I'm going to pass that back to Jeff to round us up.
Thanks, Craig and Jeremy. So yeah, so just to recap here, we focused really today. Last time we focused on why maybe the senior executive team needed to understand a little bit more the objectives behind a risk optimized organization. We're hoping through the content today and hopefully some follow-on discussion with individual customers about their particular needs, how they can go about creating a risk optimized organization. Today, we spent a lot of time on the enterprise-wide focus at the bottom. These are basically the way a C-suite or board of directors can actually build their organization and actually influence how they're perceived in the industry, and then ultimately how they are or are not rewarded by the marketplace. But again, probably the most important thing across all this that everyone's reinforced is that the goal of every integrated risk management program is to minimize deviation from expected outcomes, because it's highly valued by your stakeholders, both in the industry and the marketplace. Rob, back over to you.
Yep. So thank you very much, Jeff. I'd like to thank each one of the presenters today, Greg, Jeremy, and Jeff. This presentation will be hosted, and we'll send out a link at the end of the tomorrow with the presentation slides themselves. And then stay tuned for next year. We're going to continue the conversation around risk-enabled growth. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day, and appreciate your attendance today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.